Okay, so although this says part 2, this is really lecture 3, but we're going to deal with children mainly, and we're going to focus a lot on child labor. And so here is some depictions of child labor across the globe. And so I want to just read you a report from Human Rights Watch. It says, 2 years ago, at the age of 7, Anwar started weaving carpets in a village in Pakistan's province. He was given some food, little free time, and no medical assistance. He was told repeatedly that he could not stop working until he earned enough money to pay all alleged family debt. He was never told who in his family had borrowed money, nor how much he had borrowed. Any time he made an error with his work, he was fined and the debt increased. Once when his work was considered too slow, he was beaten with a stick. Once, after a particularly painful beating, he tried to run away, only to be apprehended by the local police, who forcibly returned him to the carpet looms. So we think about child labor. This is just one example. To define child labor, this is generally referred to children who are either exploited due to their age or type of work, or if they are of age, the dangerous nature of the work. So definitionally, we can think of any work by children that interferes with their physically and mental development, or any work which keeps the child away from childhood-related activities. So there's very different ways to kind of define child labor. Another way is work rendered by minors under the age of 15. And this is the work by Zara Arat, who is one of the articles that you read in the textbook. And so the first definition is very general, kind of abstract, where the Arat article really starts to define something that can be measured. All right, so it's kind of hard to measure the physical and mental development, or keeps child away from childhood-related activities. But basically, we can measure the number of people under the age of 15 who are working. Okay, and so if we think about, we talked about the Asian miracle under Asian values, there seems to be this contradiction between the level of economic attainment in Asian countries in particular, and human development and the level of poverty on the other. And so there is this consequence of this paradox between high level of economic attainment and the low level of human development, and that's because many of these countries are engaging in very high levels of child labor. In report after report, the children themselves point to poverty as the driving force behind the high level of child labor. There are certain facts according to the International Labor Organization. Of course, this data is a little bit old, but there were at least 250 million children who are working as child laborers, with 120 million of them working full-time. And you can see this is predominantly the majority in Asia, followed up by Africa. And then bonded labor is particularly high in India and Pakistan, and that is the description I just read you from Human Rights Watch about what happened to the 7-year-old Anwar in Pakistan. We can kind of break this down even further. While Africa has the highest percentage, Asia has the greatest number. All right, so again, according to the International Labor Organization, the Asia Pacific region has the largest number of working children, over 150 million under the age of 14. In Bangladesh, it's estimated that over 5 million working children out of 35 million. India has over 11 million children, Pakistan over 3 million, and in Burma, the ILO estimates that in 2000, over 25% of the children between 10 and 14 are working children. Okay. Here's another description of an individual in Sri Lanka. I work in a house that has 5 family members. I'm the only servant. I'm very busy all day working, washing, cleaning, and preparing food. The children in the family go to school, but I don't get to. They can also watch television, but I'm not allowed. I'm not allowed to play with the children. I'm always working. I sleep on the floor in the dining room. I've never been home to visit since beginning this work. My parents came to visit me twice and collected some money from the family, but I don't know how much. This is a 10-year-old being a domestic in Sri Lanka. All right, so what is the rationale or the root causes for child poverty, child labor? And the number one, as mentioned before, is poverty. And there is a connection to education, but the literature suggests that there's a definite connection between poverty and child labor. But this relationship is complicated by additional factors such as illiteracy of both the parent and the child. There's also socioeconomic conditions within the state and instances of sudden poverty experienced by the family, leading to high levels of adult unemployment. Okay. There's also a cultural difference, particularly in South Asia, that perceive children as adults. They tend to perceive children as adults at an early age. And the connection between poverty, education, and child labor is a vicious cycle, obviously. For many children in the region, attending school is simply not an option. Educational levels, particularly in the Southeast, lag behind the rest of the developing world, except for what occurs in Africa. In Asia, education is often expensive, is viewed as irrelevant by many parents, and may simply be inaccessible. And this lack of education follows the child into adulthood, where the cycle is perpetuated and that they grow up to be unskilled adults trapped in poorly paid jobs, and in turn will look to their own children to supplement the family's income. And so you have this, again, this vicious cycle where parents who are uneducated and who are probably bonded themselves have to continue that particular situation. Then, of course, there's exploitative working conditions. Report after report indicates that there are several major sectors or industries where child labor thrives, and I'm going to give you some of those examples later on. In these countries, there are weak labor laws that don't protect children and children's labor like we have in the United States. There's also a lack of unions. And all of this is compounded in developing countries. So who employs these children? So we have a whole host of different industries: agriculture, family, businesses, domestic labor, bonded labor. We talked a little bit about the sexual exploitation, pornography, child trafficking. Child soldiers is a big topic, particularly in many of the African countries. They work in manufacturing, construction, and mining. They work on the streets and trade and in service industries. Okay, and so again, we tend to see them in these industries where child labor can thrive. So you have forced and or bonded labor, and this is those domestics, hazardous industries. So they work in the carpet industry, the sex trade, including prostitution and pornography. Domestic labor, as it applies to child labor, is defined as work done in the home of a third party. And oftentimes, this type of labor is considered culturally accepted and is thus a common practice. Children frequently enter into domestic service in order to sustain themselves and their families. In addition, children tend to turn to domestic labor in an effort to escape family problems such as alcoholism and abuse. So in essence, there is this push and pull effect, family problems and poverty pushing children into domestic forms of labor, and a pulling effect by siblings already employed offering their younger siblings into service. And unfortunately, this type of labor is habitually tied to trafficking and slavery. Estimates of child domestic labor in South Asia suggest that as many as 300,000 children in Bangladesh, 264,000 children in Pakistan, 100,000 children in Sri Lanka, and 20% of Indian children under 14 who work outside the home are engaged in domestic labor, often to repay family loans. So this is all forms of bonded labor. There's hazardous work, includes brick and fireworks manufacturing. You can see that's happening where this boy is working here in a brick manufacturing place. The production of glassware, stone quarries, construction, the work in the beadie and carpet industries, and that's one of the articles you read in the text. And according to the International International Labor Organization, work is considered to be hazardous when, quote, by its nature or the circumstances in which it's carried out, is likely to harm the health, safety, and or morals of children, end quote. It's estimated that 2 million children in India are pressed into this type of child labor. Children as young as the age of 4 are put to work making rugs, often tied to the loom to prevent them from running away. Child trafficking generally leads to various forms of sexual exploitation, including prostitution and pornography, to domestic labor, and even to working as a camel jockey. A UNICEF report estimates that over 1 million children are subjected, either lured or forced, into the sex trade in Asia every year. Alarmingly, half of them were sold or deceived by someone they knew, 40% were sold by parents, and 15% were sold by relatives. It should be noted that child trafficking included both externally and internally activity. In fact, internal child trafficking is more prevalent in Asia and promulgated by unsafe migration, weak law enforcement, insufficient household income, ill treatment and physical abuse, alcoholism, lack of food, and forced marriages. So a good deal of the sex trafficking for children that goes on in Asian countries, those children stay in Asia. They're not externally sent to countries abroad. So Arat argues that that child labor is sustained by the employers, their parents, and the state. And as I went through all that data, you can kind of see what this means is that employers perpetuate, parents perpetuate, and the state is doing nothing about curbing child labor. Okay. There's regional differences when it comes to child labor. Among the countries in South Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal, and India are consistently among the worst offenders. The ILO estimates that approximately 22 million children work as child laborers in the region out of a total of 300 million total children. There is even human organ traders in Bangladesh. The sale of a kidney in Bangladesh can garner as much as $1,000. And so human organ traders affiliated to international organ smuggling networks help often with the help of local government officials. In rural districts and urban slums where the most oppressed workers and peasants are concentrated, you have kidney hunters, outlaw surgeons, medical technicians, makeshift transplant units, and underground laboratories are an everyday presence. When we're talking about some more manual labor in central region of Nepal, as many as 32,000 children work in stone quarries. In Southeast Asia, a large percentage of child laborers work in the sex industry, as I mentioned before. Trafficking is not limited to girls and women. Boys are often trafficked to work in construction, the brick kilns, tea plantations, as well as manufacturing jobs. Okay. There are relatively lower percentages of child labor in East Asia and the Pacific, primarily due to stronger governmental policies banning child labor, as well as education policies that require basic education for all children. Nonetheless, concerns still remain regarding child labor in the region, primarily focusing on the sex trade. For example, in the Philippines, there are reports of girls as young as 14 years old encouraged by parents to go with recruiters to work as entertainers in Japan. The Tucker article that you've read focuses on what are called the beady industry, and this idea of nimble fingers. The idea that young children have much more nimble fingers that's required to roll these beadies. And so the idea is, the myths that are perpetuated are these children must be trained at the right age, and they're going to be trained in a profession, and that child labor is an inevitable result of poverty. And so you can go onto this particular company's website to find out more about what beadies are. All right, so we think about the characteristics of child labor. Of course, this violates a nation's minimum age laws. We have age laws in the United States, for example. We know that child labor threatens the child's physical, mental, and emotional well-being, as I described. One of the girls that is working in Bangladesh was sent to the United Arab Emirates. She was 5 years old. She says, "I was scared. If I made a mistake, I was beaten with a stick. When I said I wanted to go home, I was told I never would. I didn't enjoy camel racing. I was really afraid. I fell off many times. When I won prizes several times, such as money and a car, the camel owner took everything. I never got anything. No money, nothing. My family also got nothing." This is a young boy trafficked at 5 years of age. And so we know that that leads to physical, mental, emotional scarring. There's abuse. And so we know in all these different areas there is intolerable levels of abuse. This feeds into the lack of education because children are prevented from attending school. And then it uses children to undermine labor standards, and this is the point that Zahra Arat makes in her article about the use of children is less expensive, more disposable, gets into that an element of the new slavery that Kevin Bales talks about. Okay. The physical development, again, were consequences for children, and that's the bonded labor article that's in your book. Forget this article for Tuesday business, all right? There is a detriment to the cognitive development of individuals in terms of literacy, concentration. Studies have indicated that there is a stunting of emotional development, so individuals suffer in terms of self-esteem, feel detached from families, don't understand the idea of love. And then there is a social and moral development consequences where there is you're identifying with a group that has been judged inferior, and so there is right from wrong judgments that are lacking in these individuals who grow up without social and moral development. We know that this type of slavery and servitude have existed throughout global history. We talked about that in the last couple of lectures. But the idea that children have specific rights has only emerged recently. And so the discussion board that you're asked to participate in this time deals with whether or not children have specific rights. And so while there is the UN Convention on the Protection of Children, the United States is not a party to that. And so I want to hear your ideas about whether the United States should be a party to that particular convention. So for a long time, children were viewed as preferred laborers, mainly because they're vulnerable, they're more manageable, they're cheaper, they're less likely to go on strike. And so we see these elements at play even in the United States. So we know that before reform came to the United States, we had all kinds of children working in factories as part of the Industrial Revolution. So the breaker boys in the coal mines, you had spinning rooms in Fall River, Massachusetts, where children were exposed to very dangerous conditions and long and hard hours. And of course, while they're doing that, they're not going to school. So the United States started to deal with this particular element in the 1800s, where the first child labor laws at the state level were passed in the state of Massachusetts. A few years later, states began to impose a limitation on how long a child could work, and that's 10 hours, which seems like a real long time because we have the 8-hour workday in today's environment. By the late 1880s, the American Federation of Labor passes a resolution banning child labor under the age of 14, and this is particularly in those heavy industrial areas. In the 1892, part of the Democratic Party platform calls for a ban on factory employment under the age of 15. So this should read calls for a ban on factory employment under 15. So that's a typo. And then during the 1960 through the 1937 period, this is about a 20-year period, you had attempts by the federal government to pass a constitutional amendment providing for federal oversight of child labor. Of course, we don't have that amendment. What we have instead is the Fair Labor Standard Act, which addresses child labor and sets minimum age and hours and that sort of thing. Internationally, if we think about who is responsible for the protection of children, the global community has long addressed this issue, and the efforts have manifested themselves in several international treaties and conventions. So UNICEF began in 1946 to try to address the issues of children. The UN International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights mentions the work and the age of work. The ILO Convention on Minimum Age for Admission to Employment, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is the UN, the Rights Convention that the United States is not a party to. And then we have the ILO Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor, as well as NGOs. And so in 1976, the Minimum Age Convention, I don't have that written up there, entered into force with several countries, including those in Asia, signing the document. Signatories of this convention agreed that they should establish a minimum labor age of 15, as well as work towards abolishing child labor altogether. In 1999, the Worst Forms of Child Labor Convention also became a part of the international law lexicon. This convention, number 5 here, applies to children under the age of 18 and seeks to prohibit and eliminate all forms of child labor that resemble slavery, such as child slaves, forced labor, trafficking, debt bondage and serfdom, prostitution, pornography, and forms of work that harm the health, safety, and morals of the child. Unfortunately, these agreements have had little effect in curbing the number of children pressed into some form of child labor. It's argued that many developing countries are pressured into signing international instruments designed to combat child labor. However, such measures have proved largely unenforceable. Nepal, a signatory in 1997 of the Minimum Age Convention, and a 2002 signatory of the Worst Forms of Child Labor Convention, is considered one of the worst offenders and has one of the world's worst reputations for child exploitation. The president of child workers in Nepal argues that the Nepali government is good and progressive at creating laws and ratifying international conventions. They're just very bad at implementing them, and children suffer a great deal because of this. Estimates indicate that children in Nepal make up 25% of the workforce and contribute up to 10% of Nepal's total GDP. When we look at the rights of the child, children, according to this particular convention, have the rights to an education, to be cared by parents, the right to conditions of living necessary for the child's development, the right to protection from physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, as well as neglect and exploitation. Okay, so that's the rights of the child. The ILO Convention 182 says the government must act immediately to stop the worst forms of child labor, that the government must consult with employers to identify the worst forms of child labor. They also argue that the government must do everything they can to implement this convention and also develop ways to monitor these conventions. But we know that international law is difficult to enforce. States as well as NGOs within the region are just beginning to address the problems of child labor. Okay? And so this is one of the leading issues for many of the human rights community. So the primary focus has been on passing legislation requiring some form of compulsory education. So according to Human Rights Watch, the promise of providing free and compulsory primary education cannot be underestimated in the fight to end the economic exploitation of children. The reasons are simple. Education opens up the whole future to a child, offering the chance for improved health, safety, and greater economic opportunity and the full enjoyment of their rights. So this is the international effort. But I just want to focus a few more minutes on what happens to these child laborers and the kinds of things that these international organizations are wanting to try to address. So some of the most common types of abuse is home confinement, and this is why it's often difficult for these international organizations and NGOs to really do much, because these individuals are confined within the home. When they are working in some of these manufacturing plants and working as carpet makers and beadie makers, they have eye damage, lung disease, stunted growth because they're tied physically to the loom or other types of equipment. They're malnourished. Obviously, they're isolated. They're unable to write home or call their parents, so this leads to psychological abuse. And many of these individuals are abused sexually. And so child marriage, for example, in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Bushell article in the text talks about child marriages and what are the consequences of that. Lastly, one of the last things I want to talk about are the children in Haiti. And this is after the devastating earthquake that happened a few years ago. And 60 Minutes did a report on what happens to some of these children that I want to play for you. All right, so here we go.
Almost half the victims of the earthquake in Haiti are under the age of 18, which means about 500,000 children are still living on the streets, in crowded orphanages, or in makeshift camps. Untold thousands of kids are separated from their families, threatened by hunger, disease, sexual assault, and even a modern-day slave trade. We've just come back from 6 weeks around Port-au-Prince with an American charity called the Global Orphan Project. The catastrophe may have largely dropped from the news, but we found that the emergency is still unfolding as rescue workers race the clock to save the lost children of Haiti. 10 weeks after, Haitians walk an apocalyptic landscape. Many can't be certain of food or shelter. And for families with missing loved ones, it is impossible to know who is living and who is dead. Survivors have raised urban campsites of sticks and cloth and plastic. It's crowded. Water and sanitation are poor. We found Moise Vaval and Joe Koenig of the Global Orphan Project as they rushed food and tents to desperate children.
One of them, when we showed up the first time, had 1 cup of flour, and the children were asking their pastor, the caretaker, whether they were going to die.
They had 1 container of flour for how many?
Not a container, a cup.
At this children's home, when the quake hit, the kids just happened to be in a prayer service under this mango tree. Their building crumbled. Global Orphan discovered the children.
We're really excited to have you come with us.
Loaded up the survivors and checked them into an emergency camp that it set up outside the capital. Moise Vaval is Global Orphan's country director and a Haitian pastor. While he was helping hundreds of orphans, we learned that he was also looking for his own missing son. 8-year-old Jean-Marc didn't come home from school after the quake.
Jean-Marc is a lovely child, a charming guy. Anybody who meets him, man or woman, you'll fall in love with him.
You did something that I think is quite remarkable. You came back to work.
We were looking for one, but there were hundreds here that took care for.
You were looking for one, your son,
My son.
but there were hundreds here to care for. Vaval didn't know whether his boy was dead, injured, or lost. We followed his search over the next 6 weeks, a search common to many thousands of Haitians. We caught up with Pastor Vaval again in early February. It had taken weeks to gear up the registration of lost children. Vaval took a break from his work at the Global Orphan Project to go with his wife to the Red Cross to report Jean-Marc as a missing person. He also returned to his son's school. This is Jean-Marc's school, pancaked all the way down to the ground. And these are some of the desks that the children were using when the earthquake hit. We don't have any idea how many kids are still entombed in this building, but it is many. It is a terrible thing to contemplate, but the fact is, for thousands of Haitian families, they will never know whether their children were killed. And if their children lived, they may never find out what became of them. Maybe it was to keep his mind occupied, but Vaval was working night and day. He traveled to neighboring islands to check on orphans, and he preached to his own congregation amid the rubble of his broken church. He told us, no matter what happened to Jean-Marc, his son was in the hands of God.
I never worry about tomorrow. Never. Tomorrow will be good because it's in God's hand.
In Haiti, Global Orphan was already caring for more than 2,000 children before the quake. Now, they were taking on more. We met 13-year-old Renice in the camp. Rescue workers had picked her up from the quake-ravaged streets. It's hard to believe, but the quake was to her a blessing. It ended a nightmare of a childhood. Months before the quake, Renice was raped and became pregnant. But there was more. She was also the victim of something almost unimaginable in this day and time. Renice had been given away as a child to become a household slave for another family.
There were moments when I would just stop and cry. I cried because they made me work like a donkey. Their daughter never picked up one bucket when I was there. Not once.
They didn't treat you like their daughter.
Not at all. I used to sleep on the floor.
The daughter slept in the bed and you slept on the floor, is that right?
Yes.
Renice, the pregnant girl from the emergency camp, is one who's been saved from a life of servitude. She's planning to go back to school, and Global Orphan is speaking with a Haitian family about adopting her baby. By the end of our 6 weeks, Global Orphan had taken in over 400 lost kids.
There we go.
It rebuilt that orphanage by the mango tree that we saw earlier, and it delivered tents and food to another 15 orphanages. Ça va bien? Some are getting just a little bit better. 10 weeks after the quake, we went back to Jean-Marc's school. They had brought in heavy equipment and were digging through the rubble. It was then that Moise Vaval was pulled away from his work at the Orphan Project by a call from the workers at the site. They had found a book bag that belonged to Jean-Marc. And not long after, his weeks of wandering came to an end. A few days later, he brought his family to his own church for the funeral service of Jean-Marc. He told us the moment was a grace from God, a blessing that he was able to bury his boy in a time when so many others do not know the fate of their children.
Okay, so sad story, obviously. Much of the work in human rights is sad and devastating. And in this particular event, you could see a lot of what goes on in the human rights world. So you see a catastrophe, you see NGOs and IGOs working toward trying to overcome that tragedy, and you have individuals who play a particularly strong role in the human rights movement. But this also showed you the underbelly of what happens to poor and impoverished individuals, the story of the girl who was sold into sex slavery, as well as the plight of many of these individuals' children who are probably or were likely to sold into some sort of sex trafficking or slave trade in the modern era. All right, so if we think about to move forward, how do we go about eliminating child labor? One of the main reasons why child labor occurs is because poor families rely upon their children for labor. So this gets into the meaningful wage argument in terms of how much should we be paying individuals for minimum and meaningful wages. And this is a topic that we will discuss a little bit in the next module on globalization. Enforced mandatory education policies. Again, what I read to you from Human Rights Watch about the importance of providing free and compulsory education is important. This is going to require, this is one of those positive rights, this is going to require the government to actively engage in increasing government investment in education. And then, of course, how do we eliminate poverty? This is an age-old question, not going to be solved by any one person, but there are plenty of individuals working on eliminating poverty. And again, we'll discuss this and many other issues related to the economics when we talk about globalization. So hopefully this hasn't been too incredibly depressing. Much of the work done in human rights is can be depressing, but hopefully you can see the promise at the end of the rainbow when it comes to trying to improve the human condition. Okay, so this ends our module on women and children.